The morning sun had only just begun to filter through the curtains when Franklin Turner settled into his favorite armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar creaks of wood that had borne witness to decades of family life. For years, Franklin had found comfort in these sounds, but today something felt wrong, an unease that hummed just below the surface. He set his coffee down and reached for the worn leather folder he always kept in the drawer of his desk. That folder contained the product of nearly a lifetime: careful savings, certificates, bonds, and account information. It wasn't vast wealth, but it was his security, the promise he had built for his twilight years. He had lived modestly, avoiding luxuries, and tucking away every extra dollar, with the discipline of a man who had grown up in leaner times. But as he opened the folder, a cold weight pressed into his chest. The most recent bank statement was sitting at the top, and the numbers staring back at him didn't make sense. The balance, his life's safety net, was wrong, shockingly wrong. Where there should have been 6 figures, there was barely enough to cover a month's expenses. Franklin blinked hard, convinced his tired eyes were deceiving him. He adjusted his glasses and scanned again, each line colder and sharper than the last. Withdrawals. Large ones. Thousands upon thousands siphoned out in chunks over the last several weeks. He flipped back through the folder, pulling out older statements. Just a month ago, everything had been intact. Now, nearly everything was gone. His hands began to tremble. Franklin prided himself on being careful, vigilant, the kind of man who balanced his accounts down to the penny. There was no way he could have missed this, unless someone else had their hands on what wasn't theirs. His first thought was the bank, a clerical error, a mix-up, something that could be straightened out with a firm phone call. He dialed the number, his voice tight as he asked to speak with the manager he had known for years. But the answers he received sank him deeper into dread. "No mistake, Mr. Turner," the voice on the other end assured. "All withdrawals were authorized. In fact, they were processed with the proper signatures and identification." Franklin felt his throat close. Identification? Signature? His signature was steady, familiar, unmistakable. He had not touched that account in months. After the call ended, Franklin slumped back in his chair. The room seemed to tilt around him, the walls pressing closer. Who could have done this? The list of people with access was painfully short, and then the truth struck like a blade. Laura, his daughter. He didn't want to believe it. The very thought made his heart ache in a way no financial loss could. He had trusted her, given her not just his love, but every opportunity he could afford. After her husband passed, Franklin had helped support her, welcoming her back under his roof when she needed stability. He had even taken on part of the responsibility for raising Ethan, his 15-year-old grandson, when Laura struggled. Could the girl he had carried in his arms, the woman he had watched stumble and rebuild so many times, really be the one to strip him bare? Franklin rose slowly, pacing the living room. The familiar photographs on the wall seemed to mock him. Laura as a child, Laura on her wedding day, Laura holding newborn Ethan. Each image carried memories of sacrifice, long hours worked, and dreams set aside so his daughter could thrive. Now those same hands he had once guided across busy streets might have forged his name and drained his future. He sat again, burying his face in his palms. The betrayal was heavier than the numbers on a statement. It was the cruel reminder that trust, once broken, left scars no ledger could measure. Hours passed in a fog. Franklin barely touched his coffee, now cold, or the breakfast he had planned to make. He simply sat, staring at the folder, willing it to change, praying the truth was somehow different. By evening, his phone rang. The screen lit up with Laura's name. His chest tightened. He answered, his voice low, his throat dry. "Dad," her voice came, bright and strained at once. "I need to talk to you." He swallowed hard. Every instinct told him this conversation would confirm what his heart already feared. "Laura," he said slowly, "what have you done?" Franklin Turner sat with the phone pressed against his ear, the silence between himself and his daughter stretching longer than any pause he could remember. When Laura finally spoke, her words tumbled out in a rush, as though she had rehearsed them but still couldn't find the right rhythm. "Dad, I had no choice," she began. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Marcus promised me we could finally start over, that we could build a real future." Franklin closed his eyes. The name was new, but the tone was old. Marcus, a boyfriend he had never met, yet already a presence that hovered like a shadow over his daughter's words. "You took everything, Laura," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it lay the weight of 1,000 unspoken memories. "My savings. The money I spent half a lifetime building. Do you have any idea what you've done?" On the other end of the line, Laura's breathing hitched. "It's not like that. Marcus, he knows people. He's got plans. He said if we invested now, if we took the risk, we'd have more than enough to take care of you, me, and Ethan. This isn't theft. It's an opportunity." Franklin's hand clenched around the arm of his chair. "An opportunity?" He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "Laura, you didn't just gamble money. You gambled trust, and that, once lost, doesn't return so easily." For a moment there was silence. Then Laura's voice hardened, tinged with defiance. "You've always been too cautious, Dad. Always saving, always planning, never taking risks. That's why Mom left, remember? Because she said life with you was too safe, too predictable. Marcus is different. He believes in me. He believes we can do better." The words cut deeper than she realized. Franklin remembered those old wounds, the way his wife had walked away years ago, leaving him to raise Laura alone. He had poured every ounce of himself into making sure she never felt abandoned, never lacked what she needed, and now she threw those sacrifices back at him, as though they had been meaningless. "Laura," he said, his voice shaking now, "this isn't just about money. It's about Ethan. Do you know what kind of man you're tying yourself to? What kind of example you're setting for your son?" "I'm doing this for Ethan," she shot back. "Don't you get it?" "He deserves more than the scraps you and I have been living on. Marcus knows how to get ahead. He's not afraid of the rules that keep people like us down." Franklin felt his stomach turn. Not afraid of the rules. The phrase echoed in his mind, sharp and telling. A man who wasn't afraid of rules was rarely a man who respected them. "Where are you?" Franklin asked, his voice dropping to a quiet demand. "I can't tell you," Laura whispered. Her tone softened, and for a brief second Franklin heard the frightened girl she once had been. "It's better if you don't know. Please, Dad, just trust me. This will work out." He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead into his hand. "I did trust you. All my life, Laura, I trusted you. And now you've left me with nothing." Her reply came quickly, desperate. "Not nothing. You still have me. You'll see, Dad. Once Marcus's plan pays off, you'll thank me." But before Franklin could respond, the line went dead. He sat in silence, the phone still pressed to his ear, long after the call ended. The clock ticked on the wall, each second a hammer striking against his chest. She had admitted it. Not only had she drained his savings, but she had tethered herself and her son to a man Franklin instinctively knew was dangerous. As evening settled over the house, Franklin stood and moved slowly toward the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the yard where Ethan had once played catch with him. That boy was 15 now, sharp-eyed and thoughtful, already noticing cracks in the adults around him. And Franklin realized something then. Ethan was the one person who could not be fooled by Laura's illusions. He was too observant, too much like his grandfather. Franklin whispered into the dark room, more to himself than anyone else. "Ethan deserves better than this. And if Laura won't see it, then I'll have to." That night, Franklin didn't sleep. He sat with a folder of empty accounts spread across his desk, his mind replaying Laura's words. The name Marcus rang in his head like a warning bell. The rules don't matter. Trust me, you'll thank me later. He knew men like Marcus. He had seen them in his banking years. Smooth talkers who played with other people's money, leaving ruin in their wake. And now that ruin was inching closer to his own family. Franklin clenched his fist. Laura might be blind, but he would not be. And if Marcus Doyle thought he could walk into his family's life and rewrite its future, then he was about to learn the power of a man who had spent his life reading between the lines. Sleep did not come to Franklin Turner that night. He lay in bed with the house dark and silent around him, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter's face, Laura at 5 years old, clutching his hand as they crossed a busy street. Laura at 12, standing nervously on stage at her school recital. Laura at 20, crying on his shoulder after her marriage had begun to fall apart. Those memories pressed against him now like ghosts, each one whispering a question he could not answer. Where did I go wrong? He had done everything he could to give Laura stability after her mother left. He had worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs at once, so she could have school clothes that weren't secondhand, books she loved, and a safe roof overhead. When other fathers spent weekends fishing or golfing, Franklin was often catching up on overtime, his hands calloused from labor he hadn't imagined he'd still be doing in middle age. And yet, he never resented it. Every sacrifice was worth it the moment Laura looked at him with gratitude in her eyes. She was his reason, his anchor. But as the years passed, Franklin began to notice a restlessness in her. Laura wanted more than the modest home, more than the steady but unremarkable life her father could provide. She dreamed of glamour, of wealth, of being admired. Franklin had hoped marriage would ground her, but instead it left her bitter when her husband couldn't deliver the life she craved. When tragedy struck and she became a widow, Franklin had opened his door without hesitation. "This is still your home," he told her, and he meant it. She moved back in with Ethan, and Franklin poured what strength he had left into supporting them both. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his study, those old promises felt like chains around his neck. He had given Laura everything: security, second chances, unconditional love. And she had thanked him by stripping away the savings he had built with his own hands. Franklin stood and walked to the shelf where photo albums were stacked neatly. He pulled one down and flipped it open. The pages told the story of a life: Laura's childhood birthdays, family Christmases, the vacations they had scraped together enough to afford. In every picture, Franklin saw the pride in his eyes, the belief that he was doing right by his daughter. Now he wondered if that pride had blinded him. Had he mistaken indulgence for love? Had he allowed Laura's dissatisfaction to grow unchecked, mistaking it for youthful ambition instead of greed? The question that haunted him most was not, why did she take the money? It was, how could she betray me so easily? His chest tightened as he thought of Ethan. The boy was smart, sharper than Laura gave him credit for. He saw more than he let on, carried himself with a quiet strength that reminded Franklin of himself at that age. If Ethan had overheard even half of what was happening, he would already be piecing things together. Franklin closed the album, his hands trembling. He could not allow Ethan to carry the weight of his mother's choices. The boy was still young, still capable of building a future free from the shadows Laura was dragging into their lives. The night stretched on, heavy with memories. Franklin remembered the day Laura was born, the way he held her tiny body in his arms and promised he would always protect her. He remembered the look on her face when he bought her first bicycle, when he taught her how to drive, when she came home crying from her first heartbreak. In each moment, he had been her shield. Now she had torn through that shield with a single act of betrayal. By dawn, Franklin's resolve hardened. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the mistakes or undo the sacrifices, but he could protect what remained. His grandson, his dignity, and whatever pieces of his future were still salvageable. He sat at his desk as the morning light spilled through the curtains. The leather ledger lay open, pages waiting to be filled. For years it had been a tool of habit, a way to track numbers and ensure security. Now it would become something else, a record of betrayal, a map of the truth he intended to uncover. As he picked up his pen, Franklin whispered into the quiet room, "I may have lost you, Laura, but I won't lose Ethan, not to Marcus, not to this madness. The ghosts of memory still lingered, but they no longer chained him. Instead, they fueled him. And though his heart ached, Franklin knew that sometimes the hardest love a parent could give was not forgiveness, but protection from the very child they once swore to protect." The first time Franklin Turner heard Marcus Doyle's name, it came like a storm cloud, a presence he could not see, but one he instinctively knew would bring trouble. Laura had spoken it with an excitement that unsettled him, the way a gambler might whisper about a winning streak just before losing it all. Franklin knew men like Marcus. In his banking years, he had seen their type walk through the lobby, smooth talkers, men with bright smiles and hollow eyes. They always came with grand promises, dazzling investors with confidence while quietly bleeding them dry. Those men often left ruin in their wake, while their victims were too ashamed to admit how easily they had been deceived. Now one of them had found his way into Franklin's family. Over the next several days, Franklin began asking discreet questions. He started with neighbors and acquaintances, phrasing his curiosity carefully so it sounded casual. It didn't take long before a few whispers reached his ears. Marcus Doyle had a reputation. He wasn't just ambitious, he was reckless. He'd been connected to shady business ventures that collapsed without explanation. There were rumors of run-ins with the law, of debts left unpaid, of friends who stopped calling after lending him money. No one could pin him down because Marcus was careful, slippery, the kind of man who made sure someone else was left holding the bag when things fell apart. Franklin wasn't surprised. He had felt the truth in his bones the first time he heard Marcus described as not afraid of rules. Now he had confirmation. One evening, Franklin sat across the dinner table from his grandson, Ethan. The boy pushed food around on his plate, distracted. "You've been quiet lately," Franklin said gently. "Something on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, then looked up, his eyes, sharp and perceptive, locked onto his grandfather's. "Mom's been different since she met Marcus. She laughs a lot when he's around, but it doesn't feel real. And sometimes I hear them arguing. He yells at her, says things I don't think she wants me to hear." Franklin felt his heart tighten. "What kinds of things?" "Stuff about money. About not having enough, about needing more. He told her once that you wouldn't live forever, and that when you were gone, we'd finally be able to do things our way." The words chilled Franklin more than he let show. He placed a hand over Ethan's, steady and reassuring. "You don't need to carry those worries alone, Ethan. If you hear something that bothers you, you tell me." Always, Ethan nodded slowly, relief flickering across his face. Later that night, Franklin sat in his study with the ledger open in front of him. He added a new line. Marcus Doyle, pattern of manipulation confirmed through rumors and Ethan's testimony. The pages were beginning to form a story, one more damning with each entry. But Franklin also knew he couldn't rely on whispers alone. He needed proof, something undeniable. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One Saturday afternoon, Franklin parked his old sedan across the street from a bar on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place he normally visited, but he had heard Marcus spent time there. The lot was half empty, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the daylight. Through the window, Franklin spotted him. Marcus was at the bar, leaning close to another man, speaking animatedly with a drink in hand. Even from a distance, Franklin could see the sharp movements of his hands, the way he dominated the conversation. Franklin watched for nearly an hour. He saw Marcus slap the other man on the back, laugh too loudly, then leave the bar without paying for his drink. The other man followed him out, looking uneasy, as though already regretting the time he'd spent. Franklin made a note in his ledger that night. Marcus Doyle. Habit of manipulation, associates appear uneasy, avoids accountability. Still, one scene wasn't enough. Over the next few weeks, Franklin pieced together a mosaic of Marcus's life. He learned about 2 failed business partnerships, each ending with Marcus vanishing and leaving debt behind. He heard about a woman in another town who had filed charges for theft, though the case never made it to trial. And most telling of all, he discovered Marcus had been arrested once for fraud, charges that were mysteriously dropped. Each fact tightened the knot in Franklin's stomach. This wasn't just a careless man. This was a predator, someone who thrived on exploiting others, and now he had his claws in Laura. One evening, as Franklin sat at his desk, surrounded by notes, Ethan slipped quietly into the room. He placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk. "I found this in Mom's purse," Ethan whispered. Franklin opened it carefully. It was a receipt for a wire transfer, several $1,000s, sent to an account in Marcus's name. The date matched one of the unexplained withdrawals from Franklin's savings. Franklin's hands trembled slightly as he placed the receipt into his ledger. Ethan watched him closely. "What are you going to do, Grandpa?" the boy asked softly. Franklin looked at him, the weight of generations pressing into his shoulders. "I'm going to do what I've always done, Ethan. I'm going to protect this family, even if it means protecting it from your own mother." The boy nodded, his jaw tightening with a seriousness far beyond his years. And in that moment, Franklin realized something important. He was no longer fighting this battle alone. The days that followed carried a strange tension in the Turner household. Franklin tried to keep the atmosphere steady, maintaining his quiet routines, but beneath the surface he felt the currents of unease pulling stronger with each passing hour. He could see it in Ethan, too. The boy carried himself differently now, his eyes sharper, his silences longer. Franklin suspected his grandson was holding something back, something important. One evening, Franklin found him at the dining room table with his schoolbook spread out. Ethan was bent over a notebook, but when his grandfather approached, he quickly shut it. "You've been busy lately," Franklin said gently, lowering himself into the chair across from him. "A little too busy, I'd say." Ethan hesitated, his pencil still in hand. Then he looked up, his expression caught between guilt and determination. "Grandpa, I've been looking into Marcus." The words came out in a rush, as if holding them in had become impossible. Franklin's brow furrowed. "Ethan, that's not your burden to carry." "Yes, it is," the boy said firmly. "He's in our lives now, and if Mom won't see him for who he really is, then someone else has to. You've already done so much. I can help." Franklin felt a mixture of pride and fear stir within him. He wanted to shield Ethan from the ugliness of what they were facing, yet he couldn't ignore the steel in his grandson's voice. Ethan was no longer just a boy. He was becoming a young man who understood responsibilities in ways his mother never had. "What exactly have you been doing?" Franklin asked cautiously. Ethan pulled the notebook closer and opened it. Inside were notes, scribbled with the careful hand of someone who had been watching closely. "I've been listening when Mom talks on the phone. Marcus thinks I'm not paying attention, but I hear things. He talks about meeting people late at night, about owing money, about how he's going to flip the table soon." Franklin's stomach tightened as he read the boy's words. Each note painted Marcus not just as reckless, but as desperate. Desperation made men dangerous. "There's more," Ethan continued, lowering his voice. He pulled a folded paper from his backpack and slid it across the table. "I found this in the trash outside Mom's room. It's another receipt, not just money going to Marcus, but money coming from someone else. Like he's moving it around for people." Franklin opened the crumpled paper. It was a transaction slip, this one for a large cash deposit into an account under a different name, though the handwriting on the note line matched Marcus's. Franklin placed the slip gently into his ledger, adding it to the growing collection. "You've done well, Ethan, but you need to be careful. Men like Marcus, they notice when people start pulling at their threads, and when they do, they lash out." Ethan nodded, but there was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. That night, Franklin lay awake thinking of his grandson. He hated that Ethan was being forced to shoulder such a heavy truth at only 15. Childhood was supposed to be full of baseball games and school dances, not whispered secrets about criminal boyfriends and missing savings. But Franklin also knew Ethan's strength was their greatest asset now. The boy's youth gave him access and invisibility. People rarely watched what a teenager was paying attention to. The next week, Ethan proved just how resourceful he could be. After school, he slipped into the kitchen where Franklin was preparing dinner. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly with excitement. "Grandpa, you need to hear this." He pressed play, and a muffled recording filled the room. Marcus's voice rang clear, sharp with irritation. "I don't care what you have to do, just get me the money by Friday. If he asks questions, tell him it's an investment. He's old, he won't know the difference. By the time he figures it out, I'll be long gone." Franklin froze, the knife in his hand hovering above the cutting board. "Ethan, how did you get this?" "I used my phone. I left it recording when Marcus came over last night. He didn't know I was in the other room." Franklin's heart raced. It was reckless, yes, but it was also brilliant. That recording was more than whispers and rumors. It was evidence. He reached out, gripping Ethan's shoulder. "You're braver than I ever imagined, Ethan. But promise me, no more risks like that. We can't let him suspect what we're doing." Ethan nodded, though Franklin knew the boy would find it hard to stop once he had started. The fire in his eyes was too strong. That night, Franklin added a new entry to his ledger, writing the words carefully. Marcus Doyle, recorded admission of intent to defraud. Evidence secured by Ethan. He sat back and looked at the growing stack of notes, receipts, and recordings. A case was forming, one that could not be ignored. But Franklin also knew something else. Marcus would not go quietly. Men like him never did. As Franklin closed the ledger, he glanced across the room at Ethan, who sat sketching in his notebook with the calm of someone who had just stepped fully into the fight. The boy was no longer just a witness. He was an ally. And together, they were building a truth Marcus Doyle could never outrun. The air inside Franklin Turner's study had taken on a new weight. What had once been a quiet refuge, a place for reading newspapers, balancing accounts, and writing letters, had transformed into something closer to a war room. The desk was no longer just polished wood. It was a battlefield where scraps of evidence were laid out like weapons. Receipts, bank slips, Ethan's notes, and even the secret audio recording were arranged neatly in rows, each piece a fragment of Marcus Doyle's shadowy life. The leather ledger sat open in the center, its pages filling steadily with Franklin's steady, disciplined handwriting. The words weren't emotional, not filled with the anguish he sometimes felt. They were factual, methodical, the way a banker would record debits and credits. But beneath each line was something far stronger, the pulse of a father determined to reclaim dignity, and a grandfather determined to protect the future. Ethan leaned over the desk, his eyes darting across the evidence. "It's all here, Grandpa. Look, money moving in, money moving out. Transactions that don't make sense. The recording, even the receipt with his handwriting. If we put it together, it tells the story." Franklin nodded slowly. "You're right. But stories aren't enough. If we want justice, we need this to be undeniable. Something no one can look at and say, maybe it's a mistake?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled something from his backpack. "I thought of that." "So I started keeping a timeline," he laid out a folded sheet of paper. Across it, Ethan had drawn a series of dates with arrows linking them. Next to each date were notes. Withdrawals from Franklin's account, deposits into Marcus's, meetings Laura had with Marcus, overheard conversations. Franklin studied the page, pride swelling in his chest. This, this is excellent work, Ethan. The boy flushed, but his expression was serious. I just thought, if we can see how it all connects, then anyone else can too. Even the police. Franklin sat back, staring at his grandson. He hadn't expected Ethan to be this involved, but now that he was, there was no turning back. The boy's instincts were sharp, his mind quick, and his resolve unshakable. Together they spent hours organizing the material. Franklin would dictate, and Ethan would write, filling in details on the timeline while Franklin copied numbers into the ledger. They worked like two halves of the same mind, one seasoned by experience, the other fueled by youthful determination. Late into the night, the desk was covered with neat stacks of paper. Franklin rubbed his eyes, exhaustion tugging at him, but satisfaction kept him upright. For the first time since discovering his empty savings, he felt control returning, not complete, but enough to hold on to. "Grandpa," Ethan said softly, breaking the quiet, "do you think Mom knows what Marcus is really doing?" Franklin hesitated. The question lingered heavy in the air. "I think she wants to believe in him. She wants the dream he's promising, even if it's built on lies. Sometimes the truth is too painful, so people cling to the illusion instead." Ethan frowned. "But illusions don't pay bills." "They don't keep people safe." Franklin gave a small, weary smile. "No, they don't. But to someone like your mother, they feel better than the reality. That's what makes men like Marcus dangerous. They know how to sell dreams." Ethan's eyes narrowed with a seriousness beyond his years. "Then we'll make sure his lies don't last." The words echoed in Franklin's chest. The boy was right. The following morning, Franklin made a decision. He gathered the ledger, the receipts, and Ethan's timeline, and placed them in a locked metal box. He tucked the box under a false bottom in his desk drawer, ensuring it would remain hidden should Marcus or Laura ever snoop around. "You and I are the keepers of this truth now," Franklin told Ethan. "No one else must know until the time is right." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I understand." That evening, Franklin caught sight of Laura on the porch, her voice raised as she argued into her phone. He didn't need to guess who was on the other end. Her words were sharp, defensive. She was protecting Marcus. Franklin's heart ached, but he forced himself to turn away. He could not save her if she didn't want to be saved. Instead, he would save Ethan. Back in the study, Franklin added one final note to the ledger before closing it for the night. The truth has been gathered. The time will come to reveal it. Until then, patience. As he set the book aside, he felt something shift within him. The helplessness that had weighed him down was gone. In its place was resolve, forged stronger by the knowledge that he wasn't fighting alone. The ledger was no longer just numbers on paper. It was a weapon, a shield, and a map to justice, and Franklin Turner was ready to wield it. The days blurred into one another, each carrying the same uneasy rhythm. Laura would disappear for hours with Marcus, returning home only to rush into her room or make hushed phone calls on the porch. Franklin kept his distance, his disappointment a constant weight pressing against his chest. Ethan, however, grew more restless. His sharp eyes followed every movement, every lie, until finally he could no longer keep silent. One afternoon, as Franklin reviewed the ledger in his study, Ethan slipped in and shut the door quietly behind him. His face was pale but determined. "Grandpa," he whispered, "I think it's time." Franklin looked up slowly. "Time for what, Ethan?" "To tell someone," the boy said firmly. "The police, maybe. Or someone who can stop Marcus before he ruins everything. We have enough evidence, don't we?" Franklin studied him. The boy's hands trembled slightly, but his voice carried conviction. For weeks, Franklin had been gathering and recording, but a part of him had hesitated, unsure of when to act. Now his grandson was urging him forward, and Franklin felt a swell of pride. "Yes," he said finally, "we do have enough. But we need to be careful. If Marcus finds out we've gone to the authorities before the right time, he'll lash out. And your mother? He paused, the thought of Laura caught in his throat. She'll be caught in the crossfire. Ethan lowered his gaze, then lifted it again with quiet resolve. I can do it. He won't suspect me. Franklin's brow furrowed. Do what? I'll make the call. The word struck Franklin like a hammer. His instinct was to refuse immediately, to shield Ethan from the risk. But the boy's eyes held steady, unwavering. He was no longer asking for permission. He was declaring his role. Franklin sighed, rubbing his temples. You're only 15, Ethan. This isn't a game. I know it's not, Ethan shot back. That's why I'm the one who has to do it. Nobody notices me. Marcus doesn't care what I'm doing. He thinks I'm just a kid. That makes me invisible. And invisibility is power. The conviction in Ethan's voice silenced Franklin. He had once believed his role was to carry the entire weight alone. But now he realized the truth. Ethan had already been carrying it too. Denying him agency would only weaken their fight. All right, Franklin said softly, but we do it smart. No names. No risks we can't. Control. That evening, Franklin and Ethan sat together at the desk, reviewing every piece of evidence. The receipts, the timeline, the recording, all carefully documented. They prepared a neat summary, stripping away personal identifiers that might expose them. When they were ready, Franklin placed a firm hand on his grandson's shoulder. Call from the payphone down on Main Street, he instructed. Not from here. And not from your cell. Use your notes. Keep it brief, and then walk away. Do you understand? Ethan nodded, his face set with determination. The next day after school, Ethan did exactly as planned. With Franklin watching from a distance, the boy stepped into the glass booth of the old payphone. He slipped in a few quarters Franklin had given him, lifted the receiver, and dialed the non-emergency line of the local police department. Hello, he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. I need to report something about a man named Marcus Doyle. He explained carefully, using the summary he and Franklin had prepared. He mentioned the suspicious transfers, the debts, the recording of Marcus admitting he was manipulating someone for money. He didn't give his name, didn't mention his family, only the facts. The officer on the other end listened in silence, then finally said, We'll look into this. Thank you for calling. Ethan hung up quickly, his hands shaking. He slipped out of the booth and walked calmly down the street, his grandfather falling into step beside him. Franklin didn't speak, but the pride in his eyes said more than words could. That night, as they sat together in the study, Franklin opened the ledger and wrote an anonymous tip submitted. Investigation may begin. Patience required. The weight in his chest eased slightly. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was a flicker of hope. But that hope carried risk, because if the authorities began looking into Marcus, it wouldn't take long before Marcus realized someone had betrayed him. And Franklin knew a man like Marcus would not go down quietly. The knock came late in the evening, sharp and urgent against the wooden door. Franklin Turner set aside his ledger, his heartbeat quickening. He had expected something like this, though not so soon. When he opened the door, Laura stood on the porch, her face red with fury, her hands clenched at her sides. "Dad!" she snapped, pushing past him without waiting for an invitation. "What did you do?" Franklin closed the door quietly, his jaw tightening. "What are you talking about, Laura?" She spun on him, her eyes blazing. "Don't play dumb with me. Marcus just got a call. He says the police are sniffing around, asking questions about his accounts, about his business. They're looking into him because of you." Her words struck with the force of accusation Franklin had long feared. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself before answering. "Laura, I haven't spoken to the police." "Liar!" she spat, her voice cracking. "You've hated him since the beginning. You're jealous because he's building something bigger than you ever could. You can't stand that I chose him, so now you're trying to ruin him." Franklin's eyes narrowed. bigger than I ever could. Laura, I've worked my entire life to keep you safe, to give you a foundation. Marcus isn't building anything. He's tearing everything down. He's a fraud, and he's dragging you with him. Laura's hands trembled, but her rage kept her voice sharp. You don't know him. You don't understand what he's been through. He's taking risks because that's what it takes to succeed. Not everyone wants to waste their life counting pennies in a ledger. The words sliced deeper than she realized. Franklin felt the sting of every long night, every sacrifice, dismissed in a single breath, but he did not let his pain show. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice calm but unyielding. I know men like him, Laura. I've seen them 100 times. They promise the world, but all they leave behind is ashes. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about Ethan. All he cares about is himself. At the mention of Ethan, Laura's anger wavered. Her eyes flickered, guilt creeping in, but she quickly masked it with defiance. Don't bring my son into this. He loves Marcus. He looks up to him. Franklin's gaze hardened. Ethan sees more than you think. He knows Marcus isn't who he pretends to be. For a moment, silence fell heavy between them. Laura stared at her father, suspicion creeping into her expression. What do you mean by that? Has Ethan said something? Franklin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Ethan is smart. He listens, and he knows when something isn't right. That boy has more sense at 15 than Marcus will ever have in his life. Laura's breath caught, her defenses faltering, but then she straightened, her chin lifted high. If the police are coming after Marcus, it's because someone tipped them off. And if it wasn't you, then who? Franklin's heart pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He could not let her suspicion turn toward Ethan. Maybe the truth finally caught up with him. Men like Marcus can't outrun it forever. Laura glared at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of rage and desperation. If you had any love for me, you'd support me. You'd trust me. But you've never trusted me, have you? Franklin's voice softened, though the firmness remained. I've always loved you, Laura. I've trusted you more than you deserved. But trust is earned, not demanded. And right now, you've tied yourself to a man who will ruin you. Her lips trembled, her eyes glistening as though tears threatened to break free. But instead of softening, she turned hard again, her voice cutting like glass. You'll regret this, Dad. When Marcus comes out on top, when he proves you wrong, you'll see how small you really are. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Franklin stood in the silence, the echoes of her footsteps fading into the night. His chest ached with a pain no words could soothe. It was not anger that filled him now, but sorrow. The sorrow of a father who had watched the child he once carried in his arms walk blindly into ruin. Moments later, Ethan appeared in the doorway of the study. He had heard everything. His young face was pale, his eyes wide. She doesn't see it, Grandpa, he whispered. She's so wrapped up in him, she doesn't even hear herself anymore. Franklin pulled the boy into a steady embrace. I know, Ethan, but one day she will. The truth always breaks through lies, no matter how tightly people cling to them. Ethan nodded, his voice firm despite the tears in his eyes. Then we just have to make sure the truth is strong enough to be heard. Franklin looked toward the closed door, the darkness pressing beyond it. His daughter was lost to Marcus's illusions, for now. But Ethan was right. Their job was to build a truth so undeniable it could shatter the spell Marcus had cast. And when that moment came, Franklin swore he would be ready. The confrontation with Laura lingered in Franklin Turner's mind long after the sound of the slamming door faded. He had endured many arguments in his life, but never had words cut as deep as those from his own daughter. Betrayal always stung, but when it came from family, it was a wound that refused to close. Yet amid that sorrow, Franklin knew he had to stay steady. For Ethan, the boy carried himself with courage, but Franklin could see the heaviness pressing on his young shoulders. No child should have to live in the middle of such storms, and Franklin vowed silently that he would give Ethan at least one thing his daughter could not destroy: security. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Franklin beckoned Ethan into the study. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the room, illuminating the leather ledger and the carefully stacked papers. Franklin closed the book and leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "There's something I need to show you," he said. Ethan's eyes widened, a flicker of worry darting across his face. "What is it, Grandpa?" Franklin reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and pressed against the wooden panel. With a soft click, a false compartment opened, revealing a small metal box. Franklin lifted it out carefully, setting it on the desk. Its surface was scratched and worn, but the lock still held strong. Ethan leaned closer, curiosity replacing his worry. "What's in there?" Franklin produced a key from his pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The box creaked open, revealing neat stacks of envelopes, each bound with rubber bands. Inside the envelopes were documents, certificates, and carefully folded slips of paper. At the very top sat a small bank book. "This," Franklin said, "is my hidden fund." Ethan's eyes widened further. "I thought Marcus and Mom took everything." "They took most of it," Franklin admitted, "but not all. I've lived too many years to trust in only one safeguard. A man who spends his life saving learns to prepare for storms. And Ethan, I've been through storms before." He slid the bank book toward Ethan. The boy opened it and gasped softly at the balance. It wasn't nearly as large as the fortune Laura had drained, but it was still a significant sum, enough to provide stability, enough to rebuild if necessary. Ethan looked up, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this?" Franklin's gaze softened. "Because some truths are safer in silence. If Laura knew, she would have put it in Marcus's hands already. But this is for us, for you. One day when you're older, it will be yours. But for now, it must stay hidden." Ethan swallowed hard, his young face reflecting both awe and responsibility. "I won't tell anyone." Not even Mom Franklin placed a steady hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Good. Because this isn't just money, Ethan. It's hope. It's proof that Marcus hasn't taken everything from us. And when the time comes, it may be the key to rebuilding what your mother has thrown away." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "We'll use it the right way." "Not like them," Franklin smiled faintly. "That's exactly why I trust you with this secret." You see the difference. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the hidden fund pressing between them. Franklin felt lighter for having shared it, as though a burden he had carried alone for years had finally found a worthy heir. Later that night, as Franklin replaced the box and slid the false panel back into place, he felt a surge of quiet resolve. Marcus might have drained his visible accounts, and Laura might have chosen blind loyalty over reason, but neither of them could touch the hidden fund. It was the one corner of his life they could not corrupt. The next morning, as Franklin sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, Ethan joined him, his face serious. "Grandpa," he said, "do you think Mom will ever see Marcus for who he really is?" Franklin sighed, staring into his cup. "I don't know, Ethan. Sometimes people cling to lies because the truth is too painful, but lies always crumble eventually. The question is whether she'll wake up before it's too late." Ethan frowned, his hands tightening around his own mug of milk. "If she doesn't, at least we'll still be standing." Franklin reached across the table, gripping his grandson's hand firmly. "Yes, we will. And when the dust settles, we'll have something left to build on." As the days stretched on, Franklin found himself reflecting on the irony. Laura had believed she stripped him bare, that Marcus had left him ruined. But in truth, Franklin had been preparing for betrayal long before it arrived. Life had taught him to never put all his trust in one place, and so the hidden fund remained, a quiet victory, a shield, and a promise to his grandson that even in the darkest times, foresight could preserve hope. The first sign of Marcus Doyle's collapse arrived quietly, almost anticlimactic for a man who thrived on noise and spectacle. Franklin Turner read it in the morning paper. Local man arrested on suspicion of fraud and money laundering. The article was thin on details, but the name was there in black and white. Marcus Doyle. Franklin folded the paper carefully, his hands steady. Justice had begun its work. Whether or not Marcus realized who had tipped the scales, the truth had finally caught him. Franklin knew more investigations would follow, and Marcus's charm would not save him this time. Ethan entered the kitchen moments later, hair tousled, still blinking the sleep from his eyes. "It's him, isn't it?" he asked, nodding at the folded paper. Franklin nodded. "It's him!" The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then it's over." Franklin hesitated, glancing at the newspaper again. "For Marcus, yes. But for your mother, things are more complicated." He was right. That very evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the yard, the doorbell rang. When Franklin opened the door, Laura stood there. But she was not the same fiery woman who had stormed in weeks earlier. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as though the weight of her choices had finally come crashing down on her. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "can I come in?" Franklin stepped aside silently. She walked in slowly, like someone stepping into a place they no longer deserved to enter. Ethan appeared in the hallway, his eyes wide, but Franklin gave him a small shake of the head. This was his moment to handle. They sat in the living room, the silence stretching thick between them. Finally, Laura spoke. "They took him. The police. Marcus says it's lies, that he'll fight it, but I don't know anymore. Everything's falling apart." Her words trembled with the weight of denial unraveling. Franklin studied her face, searching for sincerity. "Laura, Marcus isn't the victim. He's the architect of this ruin. He used you, just as he's used everyone before you." Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I thought he loved me. I thought if I believed in him, things would finally be different. I didn't want to live small anymore. I wanted more. For me, for Ethan, for all of us." Franklin's chest ached, but his voice stayed firm. "More doesn't always mean better. Sometimes more is just another word for greed." Laura flinched, as though struck. She buried her face in her hands. "I ruined everything, didn't I? I betrayed you. I betrayed Ethan. I don't even know why you'd let me sit here." For a long moment, Franklin said nothing. He thought of all the years he had carried her, all the sacrifices, all the nights he had gone without so she could have something better. He thought of her laughter as a child, of her tears as a young woman, of the pride he once felt watching her grow, and he thought of the man she had chosen instead, the man who nearly destroyed them all. At last, Franklin spoke. "You did betray us. You broke the trust I gave you. And trust, Laura, once broken, doesn't come back whole." Laura's shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly. "So what now? Do I just leave? Am I not welcome here any more?" Franklin's gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. "This house will always be your home. But that doesn't mean I will pretend nothing happened. If you want to stay, you will face the consequences of your choices. You will rebuild trust, day by day, not with promises, but with actions, and you will not bring Marcus's shadow through this door again." Laura lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes searching his. "And Ethan?" Franklin's expression softened further as he glanced toward the hallway, where his grandson stood listening quietly. "Ethan deserves the truth. He deserves a mother who chooses him over illusions. Can you be that mother, Laura?" Laura looked at her son, guilt flooding her features. Ethan's eyes were not angry, but they carried a wisdom far beyond his years. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than words. Laura nodded weakly. I'll try to be better." Franklin leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his bones. "Then you start tomorrow." "Not with words, Laura. With actions." That night, after she had gone to bed in her old room, Franklin returned to his study. He opened the ledger one final time. The pages were filled with dates, numbers, notes, evidence of betrayal, of manipulation, of survival. At the very end, he wrote a single line: Marcus Doyle, finished. Laura Turner, on trial of her own. Ethan Turner, hope preserved. He closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, locking it with deliberate care. For the first time in months, Franklin allowed himself to exhale deeply. The battle was not completely over. Trust once broken required rebuilding, but the storm had passed. Marcus was out of their lives. Ethan was safe. And Laura? Perhaps she still had a chance at redemption. Franklin turned off the lamp, the room sinking into darkness. His body was weary, his heart heavy, but his spirit stood unbroken. He had faced betrayal, endured sorrow, and fought back not with fists or fury, but with patience, foresight, and the unyielding strength of truth. And as he climbed the stairs to bed, Franklin whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for his daughter, that she might one day learn what he already knew, that the greatest wealth a person could hold was not money, nor dreams of grandeur, but trust earned and love kept.